Good afternoon, and welcome to our RFK Human Rights I believe it's our ninth book club. We're especially happy to have our RFK board members, our leadership council, our staff, and all our friends join us today. Thank you. And a big thank you to Nisa Patel, who manages the book club as one of her myriad duties at RFK. Thank you, Nisa. You've been doing a great job building out this program. I'm Lynn Delaney, Executive Director, and I'd like to tell you a little bit, before we get started, a little bit about our RFK Book Award. As you know, we do this a couple of times a year, with July always featuring the RFK Book Award winner of that year. And after over 30 years with this organization, I have to say the Robert F. Kennedy Book Awards remain one of my very favorite programs. The award was founded in 1980 with the proceeds from Arthur Schlesinger's best-selling 1978 biography, Robert Kennedy and His Times. Each year, Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights present an award to the book that, in Arthur's words, most faithfully and forcefully reflects Robert Kennedy's purposes, his concern for the poor and powerless, his struggle for honest and even-handed justice, his conviction that a decent society must assure all young people a fair chance, and his faith that a free democracy can act to remedy disparities of power and opportunity. This is Arthur's book. You can see it's a little tattered. I keep it right within arm's length at my desk. It is no longer in print, but it is easily available on used book sites, and I highly recommend it, not just for a great comprehensive biography of Robert Kennedy, but also for insight into the complex social and political times in which he lived, which sadly, in so many ways, is not so far off from where we are today. The award is chaired by Michael Beschloss and judged each year by a group of authors, historians, professors, journalists, public servants. We change up the judges from year to year, and we get a nice mix of people reviewing the entries. This year's winner of the 2023 RFK Book Award is Dr. Peniel Joseph for the Third Reconstruction, America's Struggle for Justice in the 21st Century. There were over 100 entries to this award. Congratulations, Peniel. The authors made a terrific pick. Peniel is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values, founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, Associate Dean for Justice, Equity, Diversion, and Inclusion at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, and professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. Peniel is also a leading voice on the Black Power movement, and among his many publications are a book about Dr. King called The Sword and the Shield, and Stokely, A Life, about activist Stokely Carmichael. I'm also pleased to introduce you to our moderator for today, Fanta Gom. Fanta is the senior manager for the RFK Compass Investor Program, supporting the content development and strategy of our work with more than 120 institutional investors and fund managers. In this role, Fanta also leads the RFK Compass Investor Conferences that gather investors, fiduciaries, and other stakeholders to discuss ways to invest with consideration for human rights across the themes of diversity and financial inclusion, technology, information, and labor and supply chain. Prior to joining us, Fanta was global product marketer at Morgan Stanley Investment Management, providing marketing support onshore and offshore. She was also the project manager for the development of marketing content for Morgan Stanley Investment Management's ESG and sustainable investing efforts. She is the co-founder of Promo, which is a developing nonprofit in Ghana to protect the rights of marginalized and oppressed. It focuses on the treatment and prevention and socio-cultural factors that can affect HIV-positive women. Fanta is a graduate of NYU with a Public of Health Master's from George Washington University. Both Fanta and Peniel come to us from Austin, Texas today. Welcome, and over to you, Fanta.
Thank you, Lynn, for that intro, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We have so much to discuss in so little time, especially in terms of racial injustice, and so much has happened over the past few weeks and the past few months. But it really is a timely discussion, and I'm honored to be in conversation with Dr. Joseph today. My parents came to the US from Senegal in 1989, who, like many immigrants, wanted a better life for their children, themselves, and their family back home. Coming to a country where, in their minds, freedom, citizenship, and dignity were achievable, even in the presence of backlash. And these four themes, freedom, citizenship, dignity, and backlash, were present throughout Dr. Joseph's book, The Third Reconstruction. I grew up in the Bronx, New York, one of the poorest districts in New York City, if not in the US, and I witnessed racial and economic injustice from a young age. From police brutality, attending Title I schools, living in horrible housing conditions, and the list unfortunately goes on. Fueled by my disappointment in this nation, a nation that prides itself on democracy and freedom for all, I knew I had a role being supporting or leading the fight for intersectional justice. March 2012 marked a turning point for me. I sat on my desk at Morgan Stanley, hearing about the murder of Trayvon Martin and later the acquittal of George Zimmerman. Through protest, passionate social media posts, volunteer and professional work, I made a lifelong commitment to racial justice. Now, fast forward to today, 2023, despite having a Black president, despite having a woman on our Supreme Court, despite what seems like years and years of progress, here we are. As I sit here in Austin, Texas, as you are too, Dr. Joseph, in a state that continues to block my rights as a woman, citizen, children of immigrants, Black person, and once again, the list unfortunately goes on, I'm continuing to witness, like many of you throughout America, attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, the recent affirmative action being struck down, mass incarceration and police brutality continuing to rise, and economic injustice prevailing. However, I'm so grateful to be part of this organization, RFK Human Rights, where we're seeking to actively create a more just, peaceful, and sustainable world, especially for people who look like me and Dr. Joseph. So I'm excited to be moderating this discussion on behalf of RFK Human Rights in conversation with Dr. Joseph. Of course, I wish we were having this conversation not in the midst of chaos, but here we are. As an author, Dr. Joseph, you are a powerful and wavering voice in the discourse on race, democracy, and civil rights. As a professor, you are a passionate teacher and advocate of Black Power studies, working to share the narratives of women, people of color, women of color, and their journey throughout country's history. So I'm really excited to dig into this content, dig into this amazing book, and talk about how you are navigating these objectives and ensuring that this generation of young people especially continue to hear these critical stories in this political climate that very much is intent on suppressing them. So thank you for being here, Dr. Joseph.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
So before we jump into this book and dig into what's happening today, I'd really like to center you, right? And not only center the work that you are doing, Dr. Joseph, but the people in the communities that have shaped you, right? I resonate so much with you, especially as I read your book, for many reasons. One, my parents are immigrants from Senegal, yours from Haiti. Two, women have greatly shaped my life, contributed to my life to this day as they have yours. We both live in Austin, but most importantly in the state of Texas, right? Where every day we are seeing nonstop attack on our rights and the rights of marginalized communities. And lastly, for us, they were key social moments, brutal moments, unfortunately, that I would say catapulted us into the work we're doing now, right? For me, as I mentioned, it was the murder of Trayvon Martin. For you, it was the murder of Michael Griffith, a 23-year-old Black man who was chased to his death by a white mob in Queens. So before we dig into the book, tell us a little bit more about what fuels you, right? What fuels this work and what fuels you to write this book?
Yeah, so Fanta, thank you so much for your comments and being the interlocutor today. I really, really appreciate it. And for your intelligence and your passion as well. You know, for me, it all starts with my mother, you know, and I definitely dedicate this award to her. My mother, Jermaine Joseph, recently passed in March of this year, and she was 83 years old. And, you know, she was my first teacher. She was a worker for 1199 SCIU, Mount Sinai Hospital for 40 years. And, you know, she's the first person who introduced me to the civil rights struggle. You know, I was on my first picket line in elementary school, you know, so I'm always in solidarity with labor. And she was a feminist, a historian of Haiti, but a big believer in civil rights and social justice. So she introduced me and my older brother not only to folks like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. and the Fannie Lou Hammers and the Ella Bakers, but the Kennedys as well. She had, she loved the Kennedys, and she had a way of knitting the stories of Haiti and the Caribbean and of Africa and Pan-Africanism and of the American Civil Rights Movement all together in ways that really inspired me. So I think one of the things I write in the book, by the time I was in elementary school, we had teachers telling us that, we had overcome basically in terms of the civil rights movement and everything was fine. And part of the reason why I understood how, hey, why are we going to segregated, Catholic school was because of my mother, right? And my mother, she had a critique of Ronald Reagan. We watched presidential election evenings together as a family. So I clearly remember the 1980 presidential election. My mom had voted. She'd become a citizen in 1976. And, she was very worried about Ronald Reagan. And she, way before, Kanye West said George Bush doesn't like Black people, my mom told me that Ronald Reagan doesn't like us either. And that his policies as governor were why she felt that he would not be a good president for, and not just Black people, but for poor people, for labor, for all these different movements, right? And as I grew older, I saw, wow, my mom knows a lot about history and politics, and that inspired me. And I thought I was going to be more along the line of being an organizer, but I went to State University of New York at Stony Brook at a time when that was affordable, and met some great professors, Black studies professors, and his history professors who really nurtured me. The book is dedicated to, these Black women who through all these periods of Reconstruction from, 18th, 19th century all the way to the present have been really key in helping us shape these ideas of citizenship and dignity, I think very expansively, in ways that obviously we still have these huge debates over, but in ways that if we pursue would actually help us build that beloved community.
That's great. And I want to stay on this theme of women, specifically Black women, right? So first of all, shout out to your mom, thank, her for the work that she has done. And of course, a reflection of you as well. But, you powerfully laid out so many Black women who have contributed to this fight for racial justice, right? And highlighted how, even though Black women, we oftentimes are the one leading and supporting this fight, we are overlooked, right? As Malcolm X said, Black women are the most disrespected women on this planet, right? And it continues to be true to this day, no matter the work that we have done, right? One important thing of many things, but one important thing that Black women have done is really centering this need for intersectional justice, right? And I also want to mention the queer community who have been also instrumental in this need for intersectional justice, right? And as you mentioned in your book, the global pandemic really highlighted this need for intersectional justice, right? If you want to pursue justice, it needs to be intersectional. I want us to tackle this a bit more, right? And continuing the work that Black women have done in intersectional justice, but especially for our audience, right? Many of our audience members who are leading intersectional fights, or audience members who, may be wondering how they can be more intersectional in their pursuit of justice, right? Talk a little bit about, this need for intersectional justice and how women have contributed to that, specifically Black women, throughout the different eras that you had presented in your book.
Oh, certainly. And so, I'll talk about I'll start with talking about my connection and relationship to Black feminism and Black feminism as and feminist teachers, starting with my mother, and community caretakers who were doing things in the community like New York City, who were both anti-poverty, but anti-violence, pro-reproductive justice activists. They were anti-domestic violence activists. They were pro-immigrants. And in New York, pro-immigration was being pro-Haitian immigration. It was being pro-West African and Nigerian and Senegalian immigration. So they were pro those things. They accepted those folks into their churches, into our communities in deep ways. And really a brief definition of intersectionality, in a lot of ways, we obviously the law professor, Kimberly Crenshaw has done a lot of work on this, but even before Professor Crenshaw, who's really, brilliant and iconic, and I write about her too, I think Black women have always been or a group of Black women have always been intersectional activists. And so by intersectionality, we just mean that, you know, Black women, and there's been some Black men who are intersectional too, who understand that our lived experiences are always multiple and multiplying. So all intersectionality acknowledges is that we are multiple beings. We contain multitudes that are connected to our economic status, our gender and sexual orientation, status and identification, our citizenship status, our ability status. You know, so it's, you know, we used to say things like race, class, gender, but it's multiple, it's just infinite. You know, our connection to the environment, our spiritual, religious connections, mental, physical well-being, all of this is this idea of intersectionality. And so for me, you know, growing up around so many Black women who were interested in these things actually helped shape my interest in these things as well. So as I was coming up, I was reading a lot about Black women. I was very interested, and I was learning. And so by the time I went to graduate school, Black feminism became one of my fields of thought with Professor Sonia Sanchez at Temple University. So, so for me, so I was allowed to get into this huge world where I found out about, you know, Mariah Stewart and Ida B. Wells, and Frances Harper, and Nannie Helen Burroughs, and just so many different Black women who were, you know, who were poets, who were intellectuals, who were business women, who were philosophers, who were labor leaders during, even before, you know, during antebellum America and before. And so in a lot of ways, that really shaped my approach to American history and African American history. And I think this book was the book where I really had a chance to write about it in a very, very, you know, sort of sweeping way. This idea of these 3 periods of Reconstruction and Black women as you know, and I say it, they're co-architects, but I wanted to center them because so often we don't. So they're co-architects of this reimagined American democracy. So even though Black women couldn't vote in the 19th century, in the first period I talk about 1865 to 1898, they were very, very instrumental by being teachers, by being organizers, by forming mutual aid societies. You know, Black women are the first folks who really organized in a specific way against mass incarceration through the work of Ida B. Wells Barnett, who's also a data scientist, a criminal justice reformer. So it's very, very interesting, their role, and really they've constantly focused on expanding our definitions of citizenship, dignity, and democracy. And I connect those folks to the work of Angela Davis and what she did in prison, and the essay that she has on Black women and racial slavery, and pushing back against patriarchal conceptions of leadership, pushing back against the Moynihan thesis, which still implicates certain kinds of Black nationalist thinking, where we can't be strong unless somehow Black women are weak, right? Where we can't both be strong together, and where we can't be leaders if we're on and sharing a stage with Black women, as if somehow that's bad. So, I do think that what's so interesting about this 3rd period of Reconstruction, though, is the way in which, even as Black women have faced a backlash in the Black community, we've seen Black women like Nicole Hannah-Jones and Opal Mehdi and, Stacey Abrams, obviously Kamala Harris. We've seen them at the forefront, Fanta, in American history in a way that we hadn't previously. And it doesn't mean in those previous iterations, 1st and 2nd Reconstruction, they weren't a huge part of it. So Dorothy Height, National Council of Negro Women, is a big part. She's one of the big 6. Gloria Richardson, who I write about in my new book, is really, arguably the leading civil rights grassroots activist in 1963 in the entire country. So, and you've got people like Lorraine Hansberry and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker, but, Black women weren't allowed to speak at the March on Washington, right? So in a lot of ways, this third period of Reconstruction is really extraordinary in the sense of seeing them so clear and so visible, in television, in movies. And of course, there's always going to be pushback and backlash, but we had never seen it this visible. And even the very fact that you have a Black woman vice president, you can see the backlash, and Justice Jackson. And like you said, those things, because racism is so systemic, those victories don't necessarily mean that you end racism, right? But they still are very, very important victories.
And that's great. And just a reminder for our audience as we, kind of talk about these three Reconstruction, periods, just want to give them like a brief, refresher of like what these three periods were before we kind of dig into that last point you just spoke of. In your book, you spoke about that first Reconstruction era emerging in the aftermath of the Civil War. It was a period that was marked by abolition of slavery and the pursuit and the promise really of equality for newly freed Black Americans. Then the second unfolded during the Civil Rights Movement when courageous activists fought for desegregation, voting rights, and equal treatment under the law. And the third, which we all have witnessed, right, is characterized by a racial reckoning sparked by events like the rise of Donald Trump, the global pandemic, and the powerful Black Lives Matter, right? So, kind of taking what you were just saying right now, Dr. Joseph, we often hear this phrase that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes, right? And as we observe the ongoing struggles for racial justice, it oftentimes feels as if we are just continuously encountering similar challenges, but maybe in a different song, right? And talking about these three Reconstruction eras, right? Can you shed light on why do we continue to see these patterns? Why are we continuing to see these issues? And how can we, quote unquote, as many people will say, kind of break that cycle?
Yeah, no, that's a terrific question, Fanta. I think the main reason we continue to have these issues is because of the story and the stories we tell each other about ourselves. So the most powerful aspect of any society, whether you're in Haiti, the United States, Senegal, Cuba, Jamaica, Sweden, Norway, wherever you are, is stories and storytelling. And I'll tell you why. And I always tell this to my students. So storytelling, much more so than written language. That's why African history is so important and indigenous history is so important. So much of it is oral traditions. And sometimes in the West, and not even sometimes in the West, especially since the modernist project of the 15th century, we've really poo-pooed storytelling and we say, what's important is written work in archives. And here's why storytelling is actually more important, because even with the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, all that stuff, right? The thing about American history, it's really about what story do we tell ourselves to each other about us. That's the story that's going to affect our institutions, the big, big national federal ones. But that's also the story that's going to affect your local synagogue, your mosque, your church, your community center, your PTA. So you can tell yourself a story about why you should hate trans women. You can tell yourself a story about why you should hate immigrants, why you should hate Black people, all this stuff. Or you can tell yourself a story about why diversity is good, why equality of not just opportunity, but outcomes and equity is a good thing to pursue, why reproductive justice is good, why environmental justice is good, right? So the reason why this keeps happening to us is that really since 1865, I argue, in the Third Reconstruction, we've had these two competing stories about American history. One is a Reconstructionist vision of American history, which supports an emancipationist, and I would say at its most radical, really an intersectional emancipationist vision of not just American democracy, but of what Du Bois called abolition democracy. So this idea of not just abolishing systems of punishment, but really investing in creating systems that allow us to flourish, versus a redemptionist vision. And the redemptionist vision is not just a racist, white supremacist vision, it's that too, but it traffics in a kind of mythology that becomes institutionalized, that became institutionalized in our policy, in our public schools, in our churches, in our civic and secular, but also sectarian institutions and regions. So one of the things about the first Reconstruction from 1865 to 1898, sometimes it gets cast as a failure. And Fanta, it's not a failure. It's just that redemptionists win what I call the narrative war between redemptionists and Reconstructionists. And redemptionists win that war. And it's not just through Plessy versus Ferguson, but it's through convict leasing. It's through the Wilmington white riot that murders all these people. It's through stuff that's happening in New Orleans and Memphis in 1866. It's Hamburg, South Carolina, Louisiana, Colfax massacres, Mississippi shotgun policy. It's Black codes, grandfather clauses. It's all these things together. And by winning that narrative war, that's where you see basically after 1898, the next 7 decades are just filled with anti-Black racial pogroms and some of the most vicious sort of violence and subjugation that you've seen in American history against one group of people. And the second Reconstruction is where Reconstructionists win that narrative war. That's how you get, and what's interesting about Reconstructionists is that it's not just how you get Black citizenship and dignity, it's how you get white women gaining access. It's how you get immigrants gaining more access, labor unions gaining more access. So I argue that the second Reconstruction, it doesn't just give you Barack and Michelle Obama, it gives you Bill and Hillary Clinton. They tag along too, because when you expand democracy, white folks usually get help the most. Exactly. Okay, that's how it is. Okay, and that's why affirmative action didn't help Black people the most. It helped white women the most nationally and in corporate America. And we've got the data to prove this, right? So what we're locked up in now, though, this third Reconstruction, is that really 1963 to 2013, I argue, is a 50-year racial justice consensus. And it doesn't mean you don't have mass incarceration within that. It means that that 50-year period is the 50-year period where you get the most Black and Black women and people of color economic progress, racial progress, wealth building, elected officials, graduating from high school and college and master's degrees and PhDs and medical degrees and dental school in American history, right? And so that's between John F. Kennedy's June 11th civil rights speech all the way to the Shelby v. Holder decision in June of 2013 that basically outlaws the Voting Rights Act by taking away Section 5, pre-clearance of the Voting Rights Act, right? And so we're now living in a post-consensus America. And so you see all the juxtapositions. They're not aberrations, Fanta, but they're juxtapositions where on the one hand, you've got the Black Lives Matter marches and 26 million people marching in the streets, but you also have January 6th, and you also have the 1776 commissions and the scapegoating of 1619 project. And people talk about cancel culture, but the biggest cancel culture are, the one political party suppressing votes and suppressing the freedom of speech to teach American history. In Texas, outlawing DEI at universities, DEI offices starting January 1st. And all that kind of hysteria, that catastrophic hysteria, you saw it during the first Reconstruction and the second Reconstruction as well. You did. It's just that during the second, we managed to actually basically tell the story, give the nation a new story of why racial justice should be a central part of the beating heart of American democracy. And for a while that works. But I think one of the lessons of all these three periods is that, whatever legislation or whatever court decisions or policies you pass, if you don't stay vigilant, those things can be reversed. And so from that perspective, we're living through some of those reversals and some of that backlash, or a lot of the backlash right now.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And kind of staying on the topic of storytelling and narrative war and the backlash that we're seeing now, we actually have a question from the audience. And if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to throw it in the chat. I'm happy to intertwine that in the discussion. But this question is related to the suppression that we're seeing, right? So this question says, in the face of book bans and other blocks against political education, how can communities learn about US history and think historically as a fight against present day injustice? And then it goes on to say, is this backlash, and I know backlash was a core theme in your book, is this backlash against the surge of political education around slavery, racial discrimination, and state violence prompted by the Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, I'll start with the first. I think the backlash is prompted just by the fact that by 2020, Reconstructionists were winning the narrative war. They were winning the narrative war. They didn't have, truthfully, political victories in the same sense where they controlled the federal government, because in a lot of ways, 2020 would have been more. It would have been more beneficial for Black Lives Matter activists if there had been a different president in office, if there had been a different Congress in office. Because when we look back about Dr. King and some of the things that were able to be passed, like one of the reasons why civil rights is able to be passed, if you examine the year of '63, is that there's really a revolution happening in the United States in '63, but you have a political party and a president, President Kennedy, and then later President Johnson, who are willing to work to try to leverage that discontent into positive public policy and legislation, right? But it doesn't, even with all the protests, I don't necessarily think you're going to get civil rights acts and voting rights acts if you just have different political parties and different actors in there. I don't know what then happens, because it didn't happen the way.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily have to mean progress, right? And so in 2020, winning the narrative war eventually leads to this Reconstructionist administration in Biden-Harris, but the backlash is really galvanized against this idea that 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, BLM, is connected to Barack Obama and the rise of the first Black president. And I write about this, right? Because Obama is a Reconstructionist himself. I write about the tension between Obama and Black Lives Matter activists who are radical Reconstructionists, right? So it's not, they're not necessarily not on the same side in an abstract way, but the details matter, right? And so Obama still believes in this idea of American exceptionalism, which basically sort of presents our national story as a bedtime story with a beginning, middle, and end. But it's really useful politically and as a rhetorical strategy. It says, whatever we've broken in the past, we can fix it, right? So if we did bad things to Native Americans, and again, we'll just say bad things, we won't say settler colonialism, because you can't win elections saying that, right? And so, and you're not going to say, hey, we set up a context where this is what happened to Black women during racial slavery and forced reproduction and rape and sexual assault, because you can't win elections that way, right? So you're always saying sweeping things like from Seneca Falls to Selma to Stonewall, right? That sounds great and everybody cheers, and you don't give the details behind that, right? But BLM, they have a different perspective, right? So they believe in a radical vision of American democracy. I think a lot of them actually respected President Obama, but they had a big critique of him because they didn't believe in American exceptionalism, right? Because American exceptionalism, that story is based on two big lies. The first lie is that Black people are not human beings, because that's the dehumanization process that is required for the wealth extraction. Not only were Black people's labor stolen from them, but we were utilized like mortgage securities so we could be leveraged for an infinite credit expansion that created the biggest system of capitalism in the world. But it's a racialized system of capitalism. It's a racist system of capitalism. It's a gendered system of capitalism, right? And that continues, that framework continues into the 21st century, whether you're looking at Black athletes and sports owners, whether you're looking at Black workers, including white collar workers. We are super exploited. Our labor is exploited. And then our representation is exploited. Some people have gotten it wrong by talking about, oh, Black people are obsolete and stuff. In the 60s, they got it wrong. No, everybody who's incarcerated who's Black produces real labor value. And even even those folks who people say, oh, okay, they're not producing labor value, the very fact of their existence provides politicians with a kind of value that they use to leverage fear and anxiety into utilizing budgets and resources to go towards punishment and systems of premature Black death versus investing. So no, everybody has value. Nobody's value is suddenly diminished. It's just that those folks who are in prison, especially the Black folks, they don't accrue the value that they are giving out in the world. They don't get it back. They don't receive it, right? And so it's very hard to change that paradigm. That paradigm is an antebellum paradigm. So, and it doesn't matter if you get 5 Black billionaires or 50 Black billionaires, because you haven't broken the chains. Those folks, you know, I applaud them. They've done it in an ethical fashion. I applaud them, right? But it doesn't break the wheel. Just like Obama's election didn't sort of end racism in Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate and stuff. Although it did something in a positive way that produced a major backlash, because the Obama election and victory shows you the power and force of multiracial democracy, right? Mm-hmm. But it also pushed back, and Michelle Obama too, they pushed back against the lie that Black people didn't have enough dignity and intelligence to be American citizens. So they become the face of American democracy around the world. But the difference between Obama and BLM activists, who he meets in the Oval Office in December of 2014, is that Obama, when he's meeting them in the Oval Office after Ferguson, he couldn't imagine a United States of America that would elect Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And they could. And that's the difference. You see what I'm saying? And it becomes, so who's the more pragmatic and realistic person in there? Is it Barack Obama with the Ivy League degrees? Or is it the Black people and Black women who are getting tear gassed in Ferguson, and they know what's waiting for the country, and the guy with the Harvard law degree does not, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a difference between optimism and being naive. In that sense, he was naive. I'm an optimist. I have no problem with optimism, right? But you can't be naive, right? And what doesn't give us, the way in which you dispel naivete is if you read American history. That's the whole thing. So I was always surprised that Obama didn't see Trump, because I've read Obama's work, very intelligent, very bright, and I figured he was somewhat of a student of American history. Those of us who are students of American history, we know before Donald Trump, there's Benjamin Tillman, there's Andrew Johnson. We know our history. This is our history. And that's what I was telling you before, Ben. It's about our history. This is our history, right? Mm-hmm. Our history. And the very fact that you have groups of people who don't want us to know this history, that of course was playing out during Reconstruction. It played out during the antebellum period too, because it was illegal for Black people to gain literacy, right? So what Governor DeSantis is doing, what Governor Abbott's doing, we have a long history of doing this. It's just that some people forgot that history. Not me, and I don't think a lot of people who are my age, Gen Xers and stuff, because we studied this history, we lived it and breathed it. And even way before Obama stepped on the scene, we thought Black people mattered. Way before BLM, we were protesting in places like New York City, where I'm from, and Queens and Brooklyn. And we were marching across the Brooklyn Bridge in defense of Black people. Marches weren't as big as 2020. They weren't as big as 2013, 2014. They weren't as big as the 1960s, but they still counted.
Powerful.
Yeah. Because we believed in the Kingian and the Ella Baker vision of the country, but we understood the other vision as well. So the redemptionist vision is really, really powerful. And I think one of the big mistakes of the Obama administration, I write this in the book, was really not defending a progressive vision of American history while acknowledging the pitfalls of American exceptionalism. He thought that if he did that, people would think he was unpatriotic, but because he didn't even call it out, right? People were never educated, and there were groups of Americans who thought he was unpatriotic because he was Black, right? And so, and again, the Obama administration shows you it proves the lie of the discourse that if we don't talk about race, it's going to go away. For 8 years, he was a stalwart person who basically refused to talk about race except on very specific anniversaries and occasions. Trayvon Martin could have been my son, different things like that. And what you got was Donald Trump, right? So you have to talk about it, and you have to actually have policies that are going to impact it, right? I mean, those are the deep lessons, right? And part of it is building up and telling a story about America that is actually consensus building. Dr. King called it the bitter but beautiful struggle that gives us a warts and all history, but that is really shared out of a profound love for the country and its potential than anything different.
Mm-hmm. You know, that this reminds me, you know, all this talk is reminding me of the fact that we're approaching a critical election year, right? 2024, there's a lot of just talk, you know, about what that's going to look like, right? And one thing that you mentioned in your book that resonated with me was this whole idea of, like, you know, the exercising your right to vote, right? But a lot of Black folks, right, and I know that I speak to a lot of my peers, are questioning whether they should exercise their right to vote, right? Feeling like a lot of these politicians are using them, right, just to get votes, that the policies and programs, et cetera, that are being developed or not developed are not benefiting the very people who have built this country, right? And as I think about, you know, this election coming up, I'm thinking about, for example, the anniversary of Mike Brown, right, which is next month, right? And I know that my U.S. advocacy team is like doing some work to support efforts there. I think about just all that has happened in history, and this idea of, you know, so many of us are thinking, like, should we even go out there and vote, right? Why does that even matter, right? So how would you kind of speak to folks who kind of feel discouraged and used and abused, really, right? Who are questioning whether they should even, you know, exercise their right to vote. You know, Black women who, let's look at the last few elections, whether it's locally or nationally, right, really carried, right, voting, right? So it's like, what would you say to folks who are questioning whether they should even, you know, go out and vote? And like, why is it important, you know, to you that we do exercise that right?
Yeah, no, I think it's incredibly important to exercise that right to vote because of all the work that our ancestors have done, and then contemporaneously, so many Black women and men and young people have done, you know, fought, struggled, died, gone to jail, you know, risked life and death and their economic viability of themselves and their children. You think about Fannie Lou Hamer to vote. I also think people have to understand that the discouragement is on purpose. The discouragement is on purpose. That's why when we think back to the first Reconstruction, sort of Black voting is probably going to be most protected between 1868 and 1876. And even then, what Black women and men do is form really armed, you know, units that allow at times dozens and hundreds to go to the polls together in defense of themselves, in defense of their lives, even though only Black men could vote. So the discouragement is on purpose. So the grandfather clauses, the poll taxes, the crazy literacy tests, that was all on purpose. And so all that occurred even in the context of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is that the new poll taxes are voter ID. The new poll taxes are, in a place like Texas, you have to, if you don't, if you're, you know, your driver's license has to have your current address, which means it's hard for students and people. Many millions of people in the country are itinerant, but they're still citizens and they can still vote, but they don't have the privilege and the prosperity of saying, hey, this is my house that I bought for $300,000, $400,000, $600,000 or $1 million, $2, $3 million, and I'm going to be here for the next 10 years. So my license and this house are completely attached to me in this community. And we have that kind of security. And yes, here it is, I'm going to vote. So, you know, I would say that, you know, one of the forces that we're seeing is a recrudescence and a recurrence of the old Confederacy, right? And the Confederacy and the Confederate States of America are anti-democratic. The neo-Confederates, the new Confederates are, and they were pro-authoritarian, and they're really fascist. And so when you see that contemporary perspective, you want to know that authoritarians want to discourage you from voting. Authoritarians who are anti-democratic, who are racist, who are sexist, they want to discourage you and make you become apathetic, right? So you have to think that voting is just one aspect, just the tip of the spear of your citizenship. But think about all the hundreds of years of people who were in very, very difficult positions, and they struggled to secure this right to vote. And so I do think it's a responsibility, it's an obligation for all of us to vote. And I think we don't have the luxury of just voting for whoever the heck we want to vote. And because it's not the lesser of two evils, it's really saying you want to do good things for people and not be part of things that are going to harm people, even as this system, of course, is imperfect. So I would say people should absolutely vote, but know why they're voting, and also know why so many people are trying to stop them from voting.
Mm-hmm. And that goes so well with, the concept of citizenship and dignity, which was huge in your book, right? And before we kind of, answer some questions that I see in the chat and kind of move towards more action, solution-oriented, questions, the two concepts of citizenship and dignity were reoccurring themes in your book, right? Both as individual ideals, but also as interconnected elements crucial to this pursuit of justice. And I love how you ended your book by saying how you choose hope, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Even in the midst of chaos and challenges, so many challenges that we spoke about today, that there is still an opportunity, as you said, and a precious chance to seize and finally attain Black dignity and citizenship at last, right? And that notion of at last is what really, struck.
And people are doing it, Fanta. People, what's interesting about people have to understand the way politics works and culture works is that you're building these archipelagos of fugitive democracy. You're building these micro units of the beloved community. There are times you feel it nationally. People felt it with the election of Barack Obama. People felt it at times with the liberation of Nelson Mandela. There are times where you feel it globally and you feel, wow, we're on the move. But oftentimes you don't. Like, you live long enough and you see that what you're trying to do, the politics you're trying to fashion into being are very, very local. They're really connected to your community. They're connected to the space that you're in and the spaces your children and your grandchildren are going to be in. So from that perspective, we should feel, we should feel very, very hopeful, because people are talking about racial justice in a much more substantive way now than they were several years ago. Certainly the backlash is bigger now too. But just the very fact that we're knowledgeable is very, very important.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, right, and speaking of hope and citizenship and dignity, especially Black dignity, in chapter 2 of that book, you mentioned how, Bobby Kennedy, we spoke about this earlier, reserved a special place in your mom's heart, right? And like your mom, Bobby Kennedy reserved a special place in my dad's heart, right? I grew up hearing the stories of Bobby Kennedy, having a portrait of Bobby Kennedy in my house. And also I'm just learning a lot about Bobby Kennedy in my work today. As you know, at RFK Human Rights, we're continuing his legacy, right, through tackling racial justice from a legal, an educational, a business, and human rights lens, right, and investment lens, rather. And we have those in this call who are representing those 3 organizational pillars. So from an action-oriented angle, right, based on your experience and your work, what are, some quick actions that people on this call right now can take to tackle racial injustice from, let's say, a legal standpoint, an educational standpoint? Like I'm seeing some questions here about what, our youth and those in college can do to create change. And also from a business perspective, right? We spoke about mass incarceration. Obviously, there is the business of mass incarceration. So what are some, quick actions that, folks can take from a legal, educational, and business and investment standpoint?
I think in terms of policy, there's a few. I mean, I would say being pro reparations is a legal standpoint, and California is looking at reparations. I would suggest everybody read the book From Here to Equality by Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen, which is an important book, African American Reparations in the 21st Century. I also think that, we should be for voting rights. So the John L. Lewis Voting Rights Act and the For the People Act. I think in terms of policy, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act should be something that we're pushing to actually get passed. I do think that we should be pushing to reverse the Dobbs decision. So reproductive justice is accessible for Black women again. And I think in terms of mass incarceration, I'm on the radical spectrum of this. I think we should be moving towards a decriminalization and really an abolitionist perspective. So I think the abolition of what we think of as prisons, we should have a new way of dealing with folks who we feel somehow are not able to be in society. We shouldn't call it prison.
And what is that new way, you think? Like, what would that new way look like?
Yeah, well, I think, when I read the work of Miriam Kaba, I think it's everything from restorative justice practices, but it's also more than that, because I think we've seen the tensions right now with progressive district attorneys in San Francisco, Chesa Bowden being recalled, Alvin Bragg, Larry Krasner. So we've seen the tensions. I think part of the reasons there's so much tension is that, one, they're not, progressive DAs are not aligned with the police, but two, we need a reallocation of public safety budgets. So we have massive infusions of money and resources and capital. So we end the homelessness crisis and the houselessness crisis in America. We end the mental health crisis in America. We fix up our schools so that, all public schools have the access of predominantly white suburban public schools in the United States that are nice. Some of them have, tennis courts and swimming pools in their public schools. So there's a way out of this, but that's the whole thing. The value gap between Blacks and whites, the value gap between Hispanic and whites, the value gaps between Indigenous and poor and queer and genderqueer and whites. We'd have to eliminate that, because the reason why I focus on dignity and citizenship so much is that dignity is the prerequisite to citizenship, because dignity is something that we're all, and I think RFK understood this. In fact, I'm sure he did, because I studied Bobby Kennedy in the speeches, and he was somebody who's a fervent believer in human rights, fervent believer, passionate, like sweating and speaking passionate about human rights, speaking in Johannesburg, speaking in Africa, speaking Europe, United States about human rights. So dignity is something that's God-given, right? Citizenship is just the external recognition of our dignity. And dignity is really, really important, because sometimes even people's parents don't recognize their own dignity, right? Because of the color of their skin, because of the gender they're born into, whatever, right? So dignity is something that we are forced to recognize amongst ourselves as individuals, and then we connect it to the collective by saying, if I have human dignity, we all have human dignity, right? So part of, I see the question about, high school students and college students. We have to teach our high school and college students about dignity, that we all have human dignity, that citizenship is just the external recognition of that dignity, which means that we have to set them, and this is where Martin Luther King Jr. was going, but Malcolm X was too. It's a human rights campaign, but it's a human rights campaign where we understand that the key to this worldwide human rights movement is achieving Black dignity and citizenship, because Black dignity and citizenship is the lowest common denominator, okay? It's universal, but it's universal in Black. When we think about this idea of human rights, we always think and say, look, we want human rights for all people, but we've seen with Ukraine, we're much more interested in Ukrainian refugees than we're interested in African refugees. That's not the fault of the Ukrainians, that's the fault of the world. That's the fault of the world, right? Yeah. So we have to be able to see Ukrainian refugees and immigrants and their children, and the empathy and love we have for them. We have to say we feel the same way about folks who are from Africa and Haiti and Latin America, right? And the only way we can do this is understanding that all those groups of people actually have human dignity, irrespective of their citizenship status. And all of us were immigrants. In the United States, everybody here since 1868 owes their citizenship status to Black people and the 14th Amendment, because remember, 200,000 Black people fought in the Civil War. That's what people forget. People act like freedom was something that was given. Black people fought for freedom, right? Black people fought for freedom, and Black people changed the tide of the Civil War in 1863 once they started to serve. And Lincoln knew it. And that's why Black people were allowed to serve, including, over 25,000 in the US Naval Forces. So this is real. And again, the only thing that'll set us free is our own history. That's what's so interesting, It's our own history, because this actually happened, This is going to be tougher in the era of AI, in the era of misinformation and disinformation that's coming externally and coming out internally as well. But it's important, the way in which we're going to get through this is by going back to those precepts of dignity and citizenship. And even, somebody asked about DEI practices in the workplace. We've got a diversity, equity, inclusion, really, really important, but we lost our eye on the ball. Affirmative action was about moral and political reparations. It was about contemporaneous and past damages. And affirmative action was an effort at repair to heal the nation's wounded soul. The slogan of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was to redeem the soul of America. And we're further away from that redemption now than in Dr. King's time, right? Dr. King was being vilified in his own time. And he told people, he said, I'm just a physician diagnosing the disease of racism like a cancer in the body politic. I didn't cause the disease, right? And so when you see people trying to ban books successfully, legislation where we've got a Supreme Court that obviously has no legitimacy or zero legitimacy, this is catastrophic. And that's why I said you have to vote, because you are very close to turning a democracy into a very young democracy into an authoritarian state. Because remember, you don't get access to democracy for most Americans until after 1965, right? So it's a very young democracy. When people say in 2026, we're celebrating 250 years, you're celebrating 250 years as a republic, not as a democracy. Because how are you going to say you're a democracy if women can't vote?
Yes.
How are you going to say if you're a democracy if Black people can't vote?
Exactly.
I mean, how are you going to say a democracy if 8-year-olds are dying in factories and are taking cotton? You're not a democracy. You're something else. You're something else, right? And again, those are the things, what I love about Dr. King and what I love about Bobby Kennedy too, is that at their best, they were willing to expose these lies. These are all lies connected to American exceptionalism. And again, when you expose lies, a lot of times there are no more standing ovations, right? They're not giving you the Nobel Peace Prize, right? You're no longer Time Magazine Man of the Year, right? This is what Dr. King told Whitney Young. Whitney Young was head of the Urban League. And after Dr. King spoke out against the Vietnam War, Whitney Young told him that Dr. King, that was a very bad speech you gave, mixing up the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. And Dr. King told him, he said, Whitney, that may get you a foundation grant, but it won't get you into the kingdom of heaven. That's what he told him, right? Because again, Whitney Young, who I love, Whitney Young was beautiful, but Whitney Young was willing to lie for administrations. He's willing to say, look, I don't have a moral center or the political integrity that we're all supposed to have. What I love about Dr. King, imperfect and flawed and broken as he was, he refused to lie. And he said, look, this country is better than trying to kill and maim and murder Black sharecroppers who are the least of these and who are the best face of American democracy the world has ever seen. We're better than that, right? And that's why we hold on steadfast to Dr. King, right? And there's hope in that. There's hope in telling the truth. But again, you're not going to win elections. So we all don't have to run for office, but we should all be trying to tell the truth. So that's what I would say to the high school students. Build up Black studies, build up Latinx studies, build up Asian American and queer studies, tell the truth and find out where you fit in that story of American history, even if the principal doesn't like it, especially when the adults don't like it, right? Because the young people are actually ready and waiting for change. But again, a lot of times the change that they want triggers people, right? It triggers them when they say, hey, is this trans person as good as me? Is this Black woman, can we be friends, right? It triggers them. I want to be friends with this disabled person, right? Everybody's triggered. Can I have Jewish and Muslim friends, right? People all get triggered. But if we just say, again, like Dr. King, the beloved community and the revolution of values starts with us, right? So it starts with us. And again, what's so interesting about Bobby Kennedy and human rights is that, you know, you think about Senator Kennedy, he was refusing to lie about all the problems that America had, but he was also hopeful and had trust that the country could actually fix it. That's the whole thing. So the lie is based on thinking that people are too weak to face the truth and they're too lazy to do the hard work and the heavy lifting that we need. And that includes people who are saying they're not going to vote. Don't say you're not going to vote. We need to vote. You know, don't abdicate citizenship that other people paid for and purchased in blood, right? Just because of your own vanity, right?
Yes. Listen, we can go on. I love this. There's so much in your book. I wish we had time to just, you know, dig into all of it. But, you know, thank you so much, Dr. Joseph, for your insights for this book. Congrats again. You know, really enjoyed having this conversation. I do want to end with a section from your book that I think definitely, hopefully, will leave people with some hope, as you know, greatly outlined at the end of your book, right? And this was definitely a part of your book that like stuck with me, and I have highlighted, and I will forever have it highlighted, right? I'm going to end with this for this session. Dr. Joseph, you said, I believe that the struggle for Black dignity and citizenship can be achieved in our lifetime. It can continue even if it takes several lifetimes. Americans of all backgrounds can choose love over fear, community building over anxiety, equity over racial privilege, and dignity over shame and punishment. So thank you so much again, Dr. Joseph. Hope you all enjoyed the conversation. If you have any more questions, you know, feel free to fill them to us, and hopefully we'll be able to respond to them at a later point. But really appreciated being in conversation, and hopefully I'll see you around in Austin.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to meet in person.
Yeah,
so good.
for sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Fanta. Dr. Joseph, thank you so much. I hope you'll come back, because I think this is a conversation that,
Oh, I would love to.
you know, there's no end in sight, and everyone look for Dr. Joseph's next work coming out. But for now, as a reminder, this is the book. It is The Third Reconstruction, America's Struggle for Racial Justice in the 21st Century. I don't know if you can see that, or there you go. But I want to thank you all for joining in. And a reminder, anyone can make a recommendation or submission for our book awards. Look on our website. If you enjoyed this, let us know by sharing it with your friends and followers and connections. Remember to follow us at rfkhumanrights.org, and on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube. So you can be the first to learn about our next event. And you can also find ways of getting involved and how you can support our work. Thank you so much, Dr. Peniel. Thank you, Fanta. It was a great conversation. Bye-bye.
Awesome.